To enjoy this episode of Forensic Tales ad-free, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Forensic Tales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
It was a July morning on Wimbledon Common when a mother took her usual walk with her 2-year-old son. What happened next would send shockwaves through the United Kingdom and spark one of the most controversial investigations in modern British history. A young woman brutally murdered in broad daylight. A toddler left clinging to her lifeless body. And a police force so desperate for answers that they focused on the wrong man, while the real killer remained free for over a decade. With renewed interest in this case following recent documentaries, I wanted to revisit one of the most infamous murder investigations in British history. This is a replay from the Forensic Tales archive, but it's a story that remains just as relevant today. This is not just the story of a murder. It's the story of a forensic failure, a media firestorm, and a long overdue breakthrough that finally delivered justice. In July 1992, 23-year-old Rachel Nickell was brutally attacked and murdered in broad daylight while walking with her young son on Wimbledon Common in London. The crime shocked the nation, not just because of its violence, but because of how the investigation unfolded. A massive police effort led to the arrest of an innocent man, while the real killer remained free for over a decade. It would take years, evolving forensic science, in a completely new investigation to finally deliver justice. Rachel Nickell was a 23-year-old aspiring model and full-time mother. She lived in southwest London with her partner Andre and their 2-year-old son Alex. From everything I read about her, Rachel was vibrant, kind, and deeply devoted to her family. On the morning of July 15th, 1992, Rachel took Alex and their dog Molly for a walk on Wimbledon Common, something that she did a lot. It was broad daylight, around 10:30 in the morning, and the path was busy. But during that walk, something unimaginable happened. A man suddenly attacked her, stabbing her repeatedly. She was left to die just feet from her son, who would later be found clinging to her body, crying and covered in her blood. The man then sexually assaulted her and then washed his hands in the nearby stream. The murder was as public as it was brutal, and it launched a massive investigation that would soon spiral into one of the most controversial cases in UK legal history. The details of the attack left the public in shock. Rachel had been stabbed a total of 49 times. This wasn't just some random act of violence. It was brutal, personal, and the motive appeared to be sexual in nature. Her body was left in an exposed position, her clothes were torn, and her injuries beyond repair. Then there was the detail that shook the country to its core. Her 2-year-old son, Alex, was found still clinging to her body, completely covered in her blood. A dog walker had found him there, and Alex kept saying, "Please wake up, Mommy," while holding a piece of paper stuck to her forehead, trying to use it as a Band-Aid. Years later, in a television interview in the documentary Death on the Common, My Mother's Murder, Alex recalled that after the attack, he said to his mother 3 times, "Wake up, Mommy," before realizing she wasn't playing and she was gone for good. That heartbreaking detail alone by itself sparked a media firestorm across the country. As news of Rachel Nickell's brutal murder spread, the police launched an immediate and massive investigation led by the Metropolitan Police. But despite their efforts, there were no obvious suspects, no clear leads, and the pressure to catch the killer only grew stronger. The Met was under intense scrutiny, and they needed something, anything, to show the public that they were making progress. Everyone who had been at Wimbledon Common that morning was interviewed. But apart from a woman who reported seeing a man acting strangely, no one had witnessed anything. So the police decided to shift tactics. They brought in a criminal profiler to help them identify what kind of person they should be looking for. And according to the profiler, the suspect was likely a white male, lived nearby, was younger, single, and probably unemployed. He might live alone or still with his mother. He might own a bike, not a car, and he could have a prior sexual offense. Lastly, the profiler suggested that he would likely be sexually inexperienced, possibly addicted to porn, and have difficulty communicating with women. In addition to profiling, the police also turned to the public for their help through the popular 1990s television show Crime Watch. In the episode, investigators appealed directly to women living in the area, asking them to come forward if they had had any strange or unsettling interaction with anyone. Maybe it was a strange date, a weird conversation they had with a strange guy at the grocery store, anything that just didn't sit right with them. They wanted to know about it. As soon as the Crime Watch episode aired, thousands of tips poured into the police. And not long after that, 32 men were interviewed and questioned, leading investigators to one particular suspect, Colin Stagg. Stagg was a 25-year-old eccentric bachelor with a history of mental health issues, living not far from Wimbledon Common. He fit the criminal profile almost perfectly. He was a loner, had a reputation for strange behavior, was single and reportedly a virgin, and, probably most important, had been spotted near the Common right around the time of the murder. The female witness who had reported seeing a man, quote, acting strangely, was brought into the station, and she was able to positively identify Stagg as the guy that she saw. But here's the problem. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing placed him at the scene. And when questioned, Stagg flat out denied any involvement in Rachel's murder. The investigation hit a wall, but the police refused to let go. They were convinced they had the right guy, so they decided to try something bold. With mounting pressure to make an arrest, the Metropolitan Police launched an elaborate undercover sting designed to get Colin Stagg to confess. At the time, no one could have predicted just how controversial this decision would become. The operation itself would go down as one of the most infamous and ethically questionable undercover investigations in all of British legal history. It was later criticized by the media as being a honey trap, a deceptive sting operation that many people felt just crossed the line. The plan centered around a female undercover officer known by the alias Lizzie James. She was part of the Metropolitan Police's Special Operations Group, and she was tasked with befriending Colin Stagg and coaxing him into revealing incriminating details about Rachel's murder. Lizzie posed as someone romantically interested in him. She reached out with a letter claiming to be a friend of his ex-girlfriend, Julie. In the letter, she told him she was more adventurous than Julie was and said that she, quote, shared the same types of sexual fantasies that he did. To put this into context, Julie and Colin Stagg had originally met through a Lonely Hearts column, the same type of personal ad that Lizzie used to make contact with Colin Stagg. So over the next few months, Lizzie worked to gain Stagg's trust, writing over 40 letters, making dozens of phone calls, and even meeting him in person. She carefully steered their conversations towards things like violence, sex, Rachel's murder. In many of these exchanges, she even shared fictional stories about her own violent fantasies, hoping that Colin Stagg would basically mirror her statements, or, in best case scenario, confess. But despite her persistence, despite gearing these conversations, trying to get him to say anything about Rachel Nickell's murder, he never did. Most of his responses were vague, awkward, or clearly aimed at just trying to impress her. He never once revealed any specific knowledge about Rachel's murder. No detail that only the killer would have known. In fact, many of his replies or responses came across as just clumsy attempts to keep this bizarre relationship going. On one of their dates, Lizzie even told him, quote, "If only you had done the Wimbledon Common murder. If only you had killed her, it would be all right." Stagg's reply, "I'm terribly sorry, but I haven't." On another occasion, he pleaded with her not to dump him, insisting he wasn't the man the police were looking for. But still, the authorities believed they had enough. In August of 1993, more than a year after Rachel's murder, Colin Stagg was arrested and charged with the crime. The arrest brought immediate and intense media attention. British tabloids painted him as a dangerous loner with a twisted and perverse mind. And for the next 13 months, Stagg remained behind bars awaiting trial. But when the case finally reached the Old Bailey in September 1994, everything began to unravel. The judge ruled that the evidence gathered through this secret operation was inadmissible, calling it, quote, "deceptive conduct of the grossest kind," and, quote, "reprehensible." The entire operation was deemed to be a clear case of entrapment. As a result, the case against Colin Stagg collapsed. He was released after spending over a year in custody for a crime that he simply didn't commit. After Colin Stagg was acquitted in 1994, the case against him completely collapsed. But that didn't mean the public didn't still suspect him. Even though the judge harshly criticized the police's tactics and threw out all of the operation evidence, Colin remained vilified in the court of public opinion. Tabloids had already painted him as this disturbed loner with these violent sexual fantasies. And while he was legally cleared by the court, many people still quietly believed that he had gotten away with Rachel's murder. For years, he lived under that dark shadow, unable to return to a normal life. He faced constant scrutiny, harassment, isolation. Employers wouldn't hire him, the neighbors avoided him, and the media refused to let the story go. In many ways, Colin Stagg became a scapegoat for a justice system that was desperate to solve a brutal, high-profile murder. Keith Petter, the lead detective on the case, also faced public backlash. But even after Stagg's acquittal, Petter continued to insist he had the right guy. In a 2001 ITV real crime documentary, he said this, quote, "Colin Stagg has been through a version of justice, albeit truncated, and he's been found not guilty. But I wonder whether he can actually say, hand on heart, that he believes people will meet him in the street and believe that. I do not believe the system served anybody that particular day." End quote. A quick note about Detective Keith Petter. After Stagg's acquittal, he reportedly took an early retirement from the police force. Later, he faced corruption charges, and the case was ultimately dismissed in a pretrial hearing due to insufficient evidence. Meanwhile, for Rachel Nickell's family, there was still no justice. Her partner, Andre, was left to raise their son, Alex, who had been just 2 years old when his mother was murdered. The trauma that Alex witnessed and the grief the family carried was only made worse by the realization that the real killer was still somewhere out there. And the failure of the investigation and the years wasted chasing down the wrong person meant that valuable time and possibly crucial forensic evidence had been lost. And the investigators, there was no backup suspect, no other solid leads, no DNA match to anything collected at the crime scene, nothing. Once Colin Stagg was acquitted, the case effectively went cold.
You didn't start a business just to keep the lights on. You're here to sell more today than yesterday. You're here to win. Lucky for you, Shopify built the best converting checkout on the planet. Like the just one tapping, ridiculously fast acting, sky-high sales stacking, champion of checkouts. That's the good stuff right there. So if your business is in it to win it, win with Shopify. Start your free trial today at shopify.com/win.
At the time of Rachel's murder, DNA technology was still in its infancy. While forensic experts had collected physical evidence from the crime scene, like Rachel's clothing and other items found on Wimbledon Common, there was no usable DNA profile that matched anyone in the system. Breakthroughs in forensic science were on the horizon, but in the early to mid-90s, they hadn't arrived yet. So for the next decade, Rachel Nickell's murder remained unsolved. Her name faded from the headlines, the investigation went quiet, and the man responsible for her murder continued to live freely, hidden in plain sight. But every year, on the anniversary of Rachel's murder, Scotland Yard came under renewed pressure to solve the case. Yes, it had gone cold, but people hadn't forgotten about it. By the early 2000s, forensic science had taken a giant leap forward, especially when it comes to DNA profiling. Cold case units across the UK began re-examining unsolved crimes, including Rachel Nickell's. So in 2002, a new team at Scotland Yard, led by Detective Chief Inspector Mick Wickerson, reopened the case. This was a mix of active duty officers and retired veteran investigators, all bringing fresh eyes and new tools to the table. One of the most significant steps they took was sending Rachel's clothing and other physical evidence for enhanced DNA testing. At the time of the original investigation, forensic techniques just weren't sensitive enough to be able to detect any type of low-level DNA profiles, or even mixed DNA profiles. But now, with the introduction of low copy number DNA analysis, it was finally possible to extract genetic material from even the tiniest traces left behind. The new team also reviewed witness statements, re-examined old police interviews, and considered potential links to other crimes. When it came to those possible links, investigators compared Rachel's injuries to other attacks, as well as consulted with forensic scientists about updated testing methods. And all of those decisions paid off. When forensic experts re-examined the evidence, they recovered a partial male DNA profile from Rachel's clothing. These results came 18 months after the evidence had been submitted for testing. Here's what they found. The male DNA didn't match Colin Stagg. It also didn't match Rachel's boyfriend or her son. While the sample was too small to confirm any identity at the time, it was large enough to eliminate suspects. That's how both Stagg and Rachel's boyfriend were officially cleared. Now, before we move on to the next part of the story, after DNA testing confirmed Colin Stagg's innocence, he sued for damages and received £700,000. Today, he's a published author, a husband, and a father. I'll share more about what happened to him in the second half of the episode. Then in 2006, as part of a broader review of unsolved crimes involving violence against women and children, the unknown male profile was run through the national database. And finally, there was a match. Robert Napper, a man who had already been institutionalized at a mental hospital since 1995. Robert Napper had been convicted of the 1993 murder of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine, a crime that happened just 16 months after Rachel's murder. The nature of those two attacks were very similar: multiple stab wounds, sexual violence, and extreme overkill. But what made the connection even more devastating was this: Robert Napper had been on the police's radar well before Rachel's murder. Back in 1989, he'd been reported to the police by his own mother for disturbing behavior, including stalking women and keeping weapons. He was even interviewed by investigators in connection with a series of rapes in South London, attacks later attributed to the so-called Green Chain Rapist. But he was eliminated due to a clerical error regarding his height. Victims had described the attacker as short. Napper was over 6'4", so he was quietly dismissed and never investigated any farther. Had that mistake not happened, Rachel Nickell might still be alive. After the DNA match was confirmed, police reassembled the case against Napper. In 2008, 15 years after Rachel's murder, he was formally charged. But because Napper had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and was found to have diminished responsibility, he wasn't tried in a traditional courtroom setting. Instead, he admitted to the manslaughter of Rachel Nickell on the grounds of diminished responsibility. In exchange, he was sentenced to be held indefinitely at a high-security mental health facility. At the hearing, Mr. Justice Griffith Williams described Napper as, quote, a very dangerous man, and as of today, it's highly unlikely he will ever be released. When the truth finally came out that Robert Napper, not Colin Stagg, had murdered Rachel Nickell, the public response was one of shock and outrage. For more than a decade, the media, law enforcement, the public had quietly presumed Stagg's guilt. Even though he had never been convicted, he had been publicly vilified. His name permanently linked to one of Britain's most notorious crimes. In 2008, following Napper's confession, the government issued a formal apology to Colin Stagg. That same year, he was awarded £706,000 in compensation for the trauma that he went through, as I mentioned earlier. Because of the police's actions, Stagg has been subjected to public humiliation, living under constant suspicion. Who knows what kind of lasting damage that's had on his personal life, as well as his mental health over the years. But as Stagg has said in multiple interviews, no amount of money can undo the years that he lost or fully restore his name in the eyes of the public. The media was also forced to reckon with its role. Many outlets had relentlessly pursued Stagg, treating him as guilty despite the lack of evidence. And perhaps most notably, the police faced intense criticism for how they handled the case, especially the psychological sting operation that ensnared an innocent man and allowed a violent killer to remain free for over a year, eventually taking the lives of 2 more people. On top of the financial settlement, Stagg had co-written and published 2 books about the case: Who Really Killed Rachel, and more recently, Pariah, a book published on the same day Robert Napper entered his guilty plea. Rachel's former partner, Andre, also published a book titled The Last Thursday in July, a deeply personal account about his life with Rachel and the challenges of raising their son, Alex. The undercover female officer who posed as Lizzie reportedly took an early retirement from the Metropolitan Police in 1998. With the backing of the Police Federation, she sued her former employer for damages arising from the investigation. In 2001, just before her case was due to be heard in court, it was settled out of court, and she received £125,000. Her solicitor stated, quote, "The willingness of the Metropolitan Police to pay substantial damages must indicate their recognition that she sustained serious psychiatric injury," end quote. But like so many other aspects of this case, this financial settlement was widely criticized, especially by Rachel's son, Alex, who only received £22,000, less than a fifth of what the undercover officer received from the Criminal Injuries Compensation Authority. Then there's the criminal psychologist involved in creating the initial suspect profile that led the police to Colin Stagg. They were charged with professional misconduct. However, in 2002, the case was dismissed. In the wake of Robert Napper's conviction and Colin Stagg's exoneration, serious questions were raised about the original police investigation. In response, the Independent Police Complaints Commission, IPCC, launched a formal inquiry into how the police handled the case. The IPCC's findings were deeply critical of the investigation. One of the central failures identified was the police's obsession with Colin Stagg as the prime suspect, to the exclusion of all other leads. The report described this as tunnel vision, a cognitive bias that blinded investigators to evidence that didn't fit their narrative. Most damning was the revelation that Robert Napper should have been on the police's radar long before Rachel Nickell's murder. Napper had a long and known history of violence against women, had been reported by his own mother for disturbing behavior, and had even been interviewed in connection with sex attacks on Wimbledon Common, the very location of Rachel's murder. But somehow, these warnings were either completely dismissed or they just simply weren't followed up on. The IPCC also criticized the now infamous secret operation, the operation that used that female undercover police officer, known as Lizzie James, to engage Colin Stagg in conversation, trying to get him to confess a crime that he simply never committed. The operation was deemed ethically questionable, legally risky, especially since psychologists later confirmed that Stagg showed no psychological traits consistent with those of a sex offender or a murderer. The IPCC concluded that this secret operation was a major misstep that ultimately derailed the case. The report called for institutional changes within the Metropolitan Police to prevent future miscarriages of justice. Although no officers were criminally charged, the IPCC emphasized the need for better training, stronger forensic protocols, and more stringent oversight when psychological tactics are used in investigations. For many observers, the IPCC report served as a grim acknowledgement. Rachel Nickell's murder might have been solved sooner, and 2 more lives might have been saved, had the police not been so focused on the wrong person. In the end, it was forensic science that brought justice to Rachel Nickell, but only after years of missteps and public outcry. The breakthrough came in the early 2000s when advancements in DNA profiling technology allowed investigators to re-examine evidence collected from the scene. Semen samples recovered from Rachel's clothing, which had been preserved but not previously usable due to technological limitations, were resubmitted for modern DNA testing. And this time, the results were clear. The DNA profile matched Robert Napper, a man who had been behind bars since 1995 for a double homicide and rape. That single forensic match shifted the entire narrative. It revealed what might have been missed. It confirmed what many had feared, that the wrong man had been vilified and the right man had been able to continue to kill. Napper later admitted to killing Rachel Nickell, though he was deemed to suffer from paranoid schizophrenia and was detained indefinitely in a secure psychiatric hospital. His confession, paired with the DNA evidence, finally closed the case in the eyes of the law. But the damage has already been done. Colin Stagg spent over a decade under suspicion, ostracized by the public, pursued by the press, and labeled a murderer despite never being convicted. In 2008, he received that formal apology from the British government as well as that money, but no amount of money could undo what he went through. Rachel Nickell's son Alex, just 2 years old when this happened, had to grow up without his mother. The trauma of that day echoed through an entire generation of his family, his friends, investigators, who were forced to confront what happens when the pursuit of justice goes terribly wrong. Still, the case left behind an undeniable forensic legacy. It proved the power of DNA evidence, not just in identifying the guilty, but in clearing the innocent. And it served as a case study for why police investigations must be guided by science, not speculation.
More than 3 decades after Rachel was murdered on Wimbledon Common, her case continues to be discussed, debated, and re-examined. In fact, renewed interest has recently emerged thanks to a new Netflix documentary exploring the investigation, the mistakes that were made, and the devastating impact those mistakes had on everyone involved. And perhaps that's why Rachel's story still resonates today. Not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because it serves as a powerful reminder of what can happen when investigators become too focused on a single theory and lose sight of the evidence. It's a case that highlights both the dangers of tunnel vision and the incredible value of forensic science when used correctly. Cases like Rachel's are exactly why so many of us remain fascinated by true crime and forensic science. They remind us that justice isn't always immediate, but sometimes the answers are still out there waiting to be found. And if you'll be attending CrimeCon UK this October, I'd love to see you there. I'll be returning to London on October 3rd and 4th, 2026. If you're planning to attend, you can save on your tickets by using my discount code TAILS.
To share your thoughts on this week's episode, follow us on Instagram and Facebook. If you want to hear my personal take on the case, sign up to become a patron at patreon.com/forensictales. After each episode, I release a bonus episode where I share my personal thoughts on the case in more detail. Don't forget to subscribe to Forensic Tales so you never miss an episode. We release a new episode every Monday. If you love the show, please consider leaving us a positive review. It helps the show grow. You can also support the show through Patreon. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Be sure to tune in next week for a new case. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to create new compelling cases for the show, help fund research, and assist with production and editing costs, you can support the show with a small monthly contribution. In return, you'll be the first to listen to new ad-free episodes and gain access to exclusive content. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensic tales. For a complete list of sources used in this episode, please visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.